This happened just last week, but it took me a while to come to terms with it. Even now, as I sit down to share it, I'm not entirely sure how to explain what happened, or how I'm even still here to tell the story. It all started with a phone call. My next-door neighbor, who's a friendly guy that I've always gotten along with, called me late in the evening. He sounded stressed and asked if I could come help him move a mattress upstairs. His mother, who's been dealing with some health issues, needed her big, heavy sleep number bed relocated to the second floor. Being the kind of person who likes to lend a hand, and since he's always been a great neighbor to us, I didn't think twice. I told him I'd be right over. When I arrived, I noticed my neighbor wasn't alone. Another man was there, someone that I didn't recognize at first. He introduced him as a friend, a priest, of all things. The three of us got to work figuring out how to disassemble the mattress from the bed frame in order to make it easier to carry upstairs. It was tricky, but eventually we managed to haul the mattress up the narrow staircase and get it placed in the bedroom. Once we had everything set up in the room, my neighbor turned to me again. "Hey, do you mind helping us move an armoire upstairs too? It's just out in the travel trailer." I didn't hesitate. I said sure, not thinking much of it. After all, as bulky as an armoire might be, it didn't seem like a big deal compared to the mattress that we just wrestled upstairs. We headed out to the trailer, hauled the heavy piece of furniture out of it, and started maneuvering it up the front stairs of this house. That's when something went wrong. The front stairs of my neighbor's house has 11 steps. I remember this detail vividly because I counted them in my head as we carried the armoire up to it. I was at the bottom end of it, supporting most of the weight, while my neighbor and his friend steadied it from the top. We were about halfway up, me on the 6th step, when it happened. My neighbor and the priest lost their grip. I saw the armoire tilt forward, and then, almost in slow motion, it started crashing down towards me. There was absolutely nothing I could do. The full weight of the armoire slammed into me, knocking me backward. I remember that sickening sensation of falling. I could feel the pavement below rushing up to meet me. My last thought was one of pure and primal panic. This is it. This is how I'm going to die. And then, I woke up. I was suddenly sitting at my dining room table, disoriented and a little groggy, with my wife's voice cutting through the fog in my head. "Are you going to answer the phone?" she asked, looking at me with a mix of impatience and concern. My cell phone was ringing. I stared at it for a moment before picking it up. It was my neighbor, asking if I could come over to help move a mattress upstairs for his mom. I froze. My brain scrambled to make sense of what was happening. I had just done this. I had just died, hadn't I? But here I was, alive, back in my dining room, with the exact same request being made of me all over again. Still dazed, I told my wife I'd be back in a bit and headed next door. Everything felt eerily familiar. When I arrived, the priest was there again, introducing himself as though we'd never met. I played along, but inside, I was reeling. This was the exact same scenario I had just lived, or died in. I agreed to help with the mattress. We disassembled it, moved it upstairs, and got it set up in the bedroom just like before. But when my neighbor asked if I could help with something else, I didn't even let him finish the sentence. "No," I said quickly, with my voice a bit more forceful than I intended. "I can't help move the armoire." That's when my neighbor gave me a puzzled look. "How'd you know I was going to ask you about an armoire?" I hesitated for a moment, then decided to just say it. Because I think I already died while trying to move it. Both he and the priest stared right at me, their expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. To prove I wasn't joking, I began describing where the armoire was in the travel trailer in perfect detail. Which side of the trailer it sat up against, how it was positioned on its side rather than on its legs. There was no way that I could have known these details unless I had already been to this activity. And yet, I had never set foot in that travel trailer before. Not in this version of reality, at least. The room fell silent as the weight of my words began to sink in. My neighbor was the first to break the silence, though, muttering something about it being impossible. The priest, however, seemed more intrigued than skeptical. He pulled up a chair and started asking me questions, his voice calm but laced with urgency. What exactly had I experienced? Did I see anything after I died? Was there a tunnel, a light, or a sense of peace? I shook my head. I didn't actually die, I said. At least, I don't think I did. Before anything could happen, I woke right back up at my dining room table. The priest leaned back, his expression thoughtful. He seemed less interested in debating what had happened and more focused on trying to understand it. Meanwhile, my neighbor still looked like he was trying to wrap his head around the whole entire thing. For the next hour, I sat with them and recounted every detail I could remember. The sequence of events, the sensations, the overwhelming clarity of what I had experienced. It all felt too vivid to dismiss as a dream or some trick of the mind. I even tried to convince myself it was just a strange, vivid hallucination. But how could I have known all that I knew about the travel trailer and the armoire? Had I never been in the trailer or seen that armoire before? Even now, I don't have an explanation. Was this some sort of lapse in reality? A second chance? Or something else entirely? All I know is that I walked away from that night with a newfound appreciation for life and a healthy dose of fear when it comes to moving heavy furniture. Hey guys, if you're into the content that we create, we've got a Patreon where you can support the show and get early access to new episodes before everyone else. Just head on over to patreon.com/Malevolent Mischief or check the link in the description and join our community today. "13 years ago, my mom passed away. It wasn't a sudden death. Her illness gave us time to prepare. But losing her left a void in our lives that we've never truly been able to fill. She was the glue that held our family together, the one who knew how to comfort, guide, and love us all unconditionally. My dad, a pragmatic man with little tolerance for anything supernatural, coped the best that he could. He buried himself in routine, eventually found companionship with a kind woman, and tried to build a life that still honored my mom without dwelling in grief. Fast forward to about 4 years ago. My dad was on vacation in Arizona with his girlfriend, staying at a quiet hotel nestled in the desert. This was supposed to be a relaxing getaway for him, an escape from the hustle and bustle of his daily life. But that particular evening, something happened that shook him to his core and left him questioning just about everything that he thought he knew. It was late, well past midnight, when the phone in the hotel room rang. At first, he assumed it was the front desk or maybe even a wrong number. His girlfriend, who was laying in bed next to him, was startled by the noise. She sat up and gave him a curious look as he reached for the receiver. The moment he said hello, he froze. On the other end of the line, he heard a voice so familiar that it felt like a punch to the gut. It was the voice of my mother. Clear, but slightly crackly, almost like an old radio transmission. She spoke just 2 words. "I'm okay." At this point, he felt his entire body go cold. His mind raced to make sense of it. Was this someone playing a cruel joke? Had he imagined it? But before he could process what was happening, he heard her say his name. Cass? That was the nickname she'd always called him, and no one else, in our family or otherwise, used it. He said his voice trembled as he responded. "Yes? Is this..." He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. He was too afraid of breaking whatever fragile connection was happening at that very moment. Then she spoke again, her voice soft yet urgent. "Tell Heather I'm okay. Heather, that's me. Hearing my name pulled my dad out of his stunned silence, but before he could say anything else, the line went dead. That static that he'd heard fell to silence, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. His girlfriend, still half asleep, asked who had called. When he told her what had happened, she was dumbfounded and had nothing to say. She pointed out that it was strange for the phone to ring at all so late at night, but she didn't press him any further. My dad couldn't let it go, though. The voice, the message, it was too specific, way too personal to be a coincidence. That's when he picked up his cell phone and called me. When I answered, he was already in tears. I'd only seen or heard my dad cry a handful of times in my life, most of them surrounding my mom's death. Hearing his voice crack over the phone brought back memories of those raw, grief-filled days. But this was different. He wasn't grieving. He was shaken, truly scared. He told me everything, recounting the call in painstaking detail. As he spoke, I could hear the disbelief in his voice. This wasn't a man prone to fanciful thinking. My dad is the kind of person who believes in what he can see, touch, and explain. He's logical to a fault and has always brushed off any mention of the supernatural with a simple wave of his hand. Yet here he was, struggling to rationalize something that he couldn't explain. "Do you think it was her?" he asked me, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to say yes, to believe that my mom had somehow found a way to reach out from wherever she was, to let us know she was at peace. But another part of me hesitated. Could it really have been her? Or was it just now both of our wishful thinking? Over the next few days, my dad tried to make sense of the experience. He called the hotel to ask if their phone system had experienced any issues that night. They assured him there were no reports of strange calls or any other malfunctions. He even considered the possibility of a prank. But who would have known to call him there? How could they have mimicked my mom's voice so perfectly, down to the unique cadence and inflection that only she had? For weeks after the incident, my dad couldn't stop talking about it. He replayed the call in his mind over and over again, searching for some detail that might explain it. But no matter how much he thought about it, he kept coming back to the same conclusion, that there was no logical explanation. What struck me most about this whole ordeal wasn't just the mystery of the call itself, but the effect that it had on my dad. My father was a man who'd spent his entire life rooted in the tangible, the explainable, but now was suddenly grappling with the possibility of something beyond his understanding. He didn't outright say he believed in ghosts or the afterlife, but he admitted that the experience had shaken his skepticism. "I don't know what it was," he told me once, "but I know what I heard." As for me, I've thought about the call more times than I can count. The idea that my mom might have reached out, even if only briefly, to let us know that she was okay brings me a sense of comfort that I didn't expect. Of course, there's a part of me that wonders if it was just a bizarre coincidence or some unexplained technological glitch. But deep down, I want to believe it was her. In the years since, my dad has occasionally brought up the call, usually in quiet moments when we're reminiscing about my mom. He still doesn't claim to understand it, but he no longer brushes off the possibility of the unexplainable. And for me, that call has instilled this belief within me that maybe, just maybe, we're not as far from our loved ones as we think. I'd like to preface this story by saying that my husband is an electrical engineer and I'm a teacher. I shouldn't have to say this, but we're not crazy people. Back when my husband and I were dating, my husband was in a terrible car crash. His truck hit black ice and he slid into oncoming traffic. His truck was completely totaled. So was the other truck that he hit. The weird thing is, though, Both he and the other guy were completely fine, not a single scratch on them. All my husband had was a single bruise on his knee. The first responders were baffled, as was the towing company and insurance companies, when they realized no one had died or was even severely injured. Fast forward to a few days after the crash. My husband comes over to my apartment. We're having a conversation about a university class that we're both in, and he casually asked me when I got the flat screen TV sitting on my dresser. At this point, I'm very confused because I've had that little flat screen since I was 13 and had had it the entire year and change that we'd been dating. I asked him what he was talking about, as I've always had that TV. He told me to quit pulling his leg and asked me what I did with the old tube TV I had. I had no idea what he was talking about and told him such. He's convinced I had a tube TV. I proceeded to get on Facebook and showed him a picture that we had taken 2 weeks prior with the TV in the background. It's the same flat screen in the picture. My husband goes white, like he's seen a ghost, and just stares off into space for a minute. His eyes started to water. I asked him what's wrong, and he said, "I swear to God, I'm not crazy. You've had a tube TV since we began dating. It was a tube TV when we took that picture. I remember it." I brushed it off as his head being rattled from the accident, and he didn't bring it up again. However, anytime we hung out in my room, I'd find him looking at that TV weirdly. Fast forward 7 years. My husband and I have been married for a few years at this point and decide that we're ready to be parents. I'm not on birth control, and we decide that whatever happens, happens. We're not actively trying, but not preventing it either. So we're on vacation in Italy, wandering around Rome, and I feel like utter shit. I had had my period the week before, and it was the worst one I'd had in my entire life. As we're walking around, I'm suffering from back pain, chills, and horrific cramping. I go to the bathroom in a cafe and promptly hurl my guts out. I have the runs and realize I'm menstruating heavily. Obviously, I'm a bit weirded out since I just had my period. I clean myself up, go back to my husband and tell him I think I need a doctor. I have a pretty high pain tolerance, but this is insane. It's getting to the point I'm having trouble walking, and I'm starting to feel pain in my shoulders. I don't want to ruin our vacation, but I'm starting to really worry. My husband is much smarter than me. He sees the state I'm in and says I'm visibly paler than when I went into the bathroom, so he gets me help. 20 minutes later, I'm on a stretcher and being taken to the hospital. An hour after that, I'm being prepped for emergency surgery. As the doctor tells me, I have a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. I have heavy internal bleeding, and if he doesn't perform the surgery, I'm going to die. 6 hours later, I wake up very sore and exhausted. The doctor tells me I'm lucky. If I'd waited any longer to seek medical attention, I'd be dead. Husband stays with me in the hospital the first night, then gets a hotel for the rest of my stay. A week later, we're cleared to fly home, and I go through a grueling month of healing from the surgery. 2 months after our return, somehow my husband and I get on the topic of fires, and he goes on about the dangers of kitchen fires, to which I say, "No need to worry, we're all set with the extinguisher in the closet." He looks at me like I have 3 heads, and asks me what I'm talking about. I remind him about the extinguisher in the front closet where we keep the coats. We've had it for 3 years. After all, he insisted we buy one when we bought the house. My husband shakes his head and tells me he has no idea what I'm talking about. We don't own a fire extinguisher. I remind him about not only my memories of fighting about if we really needed one, where to put it, buying it from Home Depot, but also installing it to the wall in the closet. He looks at me with confusion and tells me none of those things happened. I get up in a huff, go to the front closet to show it to him, all the while cussing at him for being such an asshole, for forgetting our 2-week fight about it, when lo and behold, there's no extinguisher. Not only is there no extinguisher, but there's no holes in the wall where I know we installed it. No fresh paint either. This wall has clearly never been touched. I insist that he's moved it and fixed the wall, then asked why the f he would play such a stupid prank. He continues to insist that we've never had one, let alone talked about getting one. This goes on for several minutes. I'm approaching hysterics, telling him to quit playing with me, when he finally says, "Now you know how I feel about that TV." We didn't end up speaking about it for a long time, and it was only after we found several threads on Reddit talking about certain things that he brought up this theory that perhaps in another timeline or dimension, whatever you want to call it, we both actually died, and we reset like a video game, and the TV and extinguisher are just glitches. I don't know if I agree with him. All I know is that I've never been so rattled in my whole life, and every time I get something out of the closet, I'm overwhelmed with this feeling of wrongness. I know the extinguisher should be there, but somehow it's just not, and I can't explain it. He says he'll go to his grave swearing that I had that tube TV.